So we are continuing with our 4-part sermon series, not part 2, of cultivating a generous life. We have that image we had from that first week about planting something and growing it. We're talking about how we plant and grow generosity in our lives and understand that the word generosity and an understanding for it and getting a sense of what that is, how we can live it. It's an understanding, look at this, that all that we have, all that we are and will ever become is not for us to possess. And that can be challenging. But it's to be what? But to be used for others to advance the kingdom for God's glory. And that can be powerful when we understand and look at generosity, because we have become so self-centered in our culture that we don't even understand what generosity is. We may throw out the term, but to truly live that all that we are, all that we have, and will ever be is because of God. And to understand we use it for His glory. So here's that question we threw out that first week. What do I or we hold back for ourselves or mine over the divine or for God? And it's one we're asking to ponder throughout this whole sermon series. And that first week we talked about giving rather than receiving. And I've said before, I never want to hear anyone say, oh, I missed last week. Well, we put that up on the website so you can go back and kind of catch up to allow the Lord to speak to you there. So part 1, you can go back and listen to that on our website to hear maybe what God's message is for that first week. But for today, we're looking at giving with the right motives. What does the word motives actually mean? It's kind of like the reason behind we do things. Maybe the thing is the why. Why do we do things? We're looking at generosity, giving to others to see why we do it. What motivates us? What drives us? Why do we do these type of things? And so I thought a good way to start today's message is to let us start digging in, because we've been using this kind of planting or small plant analogy about digging into. Have you ever evaluated your motives for giving? Why do you do it? What's the reason behind it? And we're going to look at today's gospel lesson where we talk about that very thing. And here's 5 questions, though, to get us thinking about our motives. Question number 1, if no one ever knew what we were doing, and that regards to our giving, our serving, and even our sacrificing, would we still do it? First question to ponder as we look at the why or the reasons why we give for our generosity. If no one ever knew, would we still do it? Question number 2, would we joyfully take a lesser position, look at this, if God asked us to do it? You see, we live in a culture all the time where we're asked to kind of move up or down the ladder. Move up. Move up to look for the promotion, the next position higher than where we were before. But what if, in our lives, God would ask us to step down? Oh, because this is evaluating, because if God would ask you to maybe do something which you see as lesser, but maybe for His greater glory or purpose, would we do it? Evaluating our motives. Third question, if those we serve, look at that word, never, how often does that happen then? Never. It doesn't happen. If they never show gratitude or repay us in any way, would we still do it? Would you serve someone if they never said thank you? I mean, even as parents, you kind of hear that, don't you? You give your kids something and you're like, hello? What do you have to say? Oh, well, thank you, and then they're running off. But what about serving in difficult situations and they never say thank you or have gratitude? Would you still do it? What's your motive for giving then? Looking for praise. Number 4, if others misunderstood or criticized our actions, would we stop? Especially if God is the one telling you to do it. This you'll see happen in the service, even in a church setting many times. People will think that they are called to serve and do things, but then someone says something negative about it. And then the next thing is, I'm done. I'm out of there. Even though God has told you to do what? Keep doing it. You want a good position for that? Right here is one of them, where many times you get criticized as being the one who says something, and there have been times when I'm like, Lord, I'd like to stop. But then the Lord says, but I've called you, and that's why you come back and do it. Think about that, and whatever you're serving others, if you're criticized, but God is telling you to do it, do you stop? Or should you stop? Last question. Are we serving, giving, or sacrificing for the praise of others? waiting to hear someone say, oh, today that was just wonderful, or a great job in what you did on the praise team, or great job in how you welcome people in the park? Are we looking for praise of other people, or are we looking for praise from God? What motivates? Why do you do things? What's the reason behind it? And sometimes it could be for all the wrong motives. So consider something. Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, he challenges our motives. And this can be difficult. The Sermon on the Mount, and Mike shared this with actually talking about the building on the firm foundation. That's actually end of his Sermon on the Mount story. In Matthew's Gospel, chapters 5, 6, and 7 kind of cover through the Sermon on the Mount. And I will tell you, when I first came back to the Lord in my early 20s, and I remember being in college, and most people, when you first become a Christian, they say, oh, you got to read the Gospel of John. So I started instead to read in the Gospel of Matthew. I just didn't listen, I guess. And I read through Matthew's Gospel, and I remember distinctly doing it in my dorm room when I was by myself, and when my twin brother was off seeing his girlfriend in Pittsburgh. It was me left alone reading on a dorm. Now you think, well, wait a minute, you're in your dorm room in college. Shouldn't you be partying? I'm in there reading my Bible. Boy, that Mark guy was strange. But I was reading my Bible and going through this for the first time, and I hit the Sermon on the Mount. And I will tell you, some people think about Jesus, and they think, oh, well, he's all about love, 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 and he is. He's truly all those things. But if you don't think it's challenging to look at what he had to say, the Sermon on the Mount rocks my world, or rocked my world then, and to this day, it still does. It is one of the most challenging words in which you hear from Jesus. Oh, he talks about the Beatitudes in the beginning of it in Matthew's Gospel. But then he goes in even in that 5th chapter to say, do not think, he says, that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets, meaning what we heard from even Jeremiah today. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For I truly tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches other accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches those commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness is a word for our today. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teacher of law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And I will tell you, as a 20-something sitting in my dorm reading that, I'm like, uh-oh. Wait a minute. Because when people are saying, well, this is difficult, this ethos about ethics or how we live our lives is a challenge, and Jesus calls to a much higher level. And obviously, he is that fulfillment of all of these things, which is why we need Jesus to complete us in our brokenness. But it's not surprising, throughout the Sermon on the Mount, he challenges us. And one of the things he challenges us in the 6th chapter, as he's preaching this, is our motives for our giving and giving to the needing. So this is important. This is a challenging message as part of a small piece, only a few verses from it. Matthew's Gospel, the 6th chapter, verses 1 to 4, looking at a section, 4 verses, giving to the needy. He starts off, be careful not to practice your righteousness. We just heard that in the 5th chapter. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets. Don't do that. Just to see if you're paying attention. Don't announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, it means listen up to this, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Let's break this down and look at these verses. To talk about giving and generosity or charity, maybe your verses may have said giving to the alms or giving to the needy, or even what we might understand better means charity, how we give to charity, those who are in need. How do we give to the needy? And I saw this in a commentary by Barclay this week, and maybe I just want to throw this up there to understand this. Deeply established in the Jewish mind, meaning the audience that he's speaking to then, look, to give alms or give to those in need or to charity, to be righteous, look at this, or one and the same thing. So we're talking about trying to understand where he said, be careful with your righteousness. Don't practice it the wrong way. And he says in that time the people had it one and one. To give to charity and to be righteous were one and the same thing. To give was to gain merit in the sight of God and forgiveness for past sins. Meaning it was a call to actually do it, to gain God's approval. Now let's get behind the reason or the why behind it. Practicing your righteousness with care. So you can take a greater look at that word in the Greek. Not that I expect you to memorize this or know this, but that word in its meaning says the way, the why, you could say, in which you may obtain a state approved of God. How do you get in that relationship or understanding with how we should practice righteousness to attain the state of approval of God? And he says it, and I think this is key, danger of the image of righteousness, meaning the surface level stuff. How many people today, when they got ready, looked in a mirror to brush their teeth, to comb their hair, to make sure they were all right? They looked at their image to make sure before they come to church, they were all together. So turn to the person next to you and to see if they're put together right now. They all right? They got their image all going right? Right? They're checking things out. Ellen, did I say you say no? Oh, you're talking about Teddy? He doesn't look good today? Teddy, I think you look good today, brother. Yeah, all right. And the thing, we work on that image there, but here I think is what Jesus is getting. Not that. Because you may not look all that great. And I know the older I get, the less great I look. But I think about that, and I think what Jesus is saying here is we're not focused on the image of how you looked for everyone when you came in here today. And don't focus on that, or how good you may appear on the surface of having it all together. Because as we read from the very beginning for the call to worship, Jesus and God looks at the heart of who we are. And one of the things that could be a little challenging for some of us is there's no hiding from that. You may have covered yourself up well on the surface and even given the image that you have it all together, but guess what God is looking at this morning? The heart, and then he says even the mind, going deeper into who we are. And as he talks about giving, he says, look, some people give really well on the surface, but their heart is not there in it. So they create this image of righteousness, not truly of God. Trumpeting, sounding the trumpets of their giving. I'm giving a big check, oh, look at me. And they have this image, but their heart's not quite right. So here's a pondering question. Is it hard to practice in front of others without thinking about their opinion of you? And this is one of the things he's, I think, kind of getting at too. It's kind of hard to do good things to get the approval of God without thinking about the people who are also seeing you do it. The appearance and to think it looks good. So here's a story for you. If you've been coming to the OC for a while, you have probably heard me share this, but I think this ties in quite nicely to what we're looking at today about the surface or the image. So you heard about this guy I told you in college who came to the Lord and wanted to serve him in my 20s. Well, when I graduated from school, I worked in an accounting firm, but then I also started to get very involved in the church. And on the image, on the surface, I was like trying to do all the right things. Whenever there was needs, whenever there was things that talked about, I'm going to help, I'm going to serve, teaching classes, serving in different ways. And one of the opportunities that came up, someone got up in front of the church that day and said, look, at our church, we have these banks, and they have all these weeds, and you can't see them now there, but all along here, and down in the front too, and we're calling people to come out to help. And a guy in his 20s, I decided, I'm going to serve the Lord. And on the surface, if anyone saw me and I showed up there and worked for several hours on this spot right next to the steps, all this area here, and I worked for hours, and I filled up to 7 lawn bags. You know the lawn bags, not the small, the big huge gallon-sized bags, I had filled 7 of them, and I was sweaty. And the white shirt I had looked no longer white that I was wearing. It was all dirty. And I think I was bitten several times from different bugs. I had all kinds of thorns and things in my fingers. I was hot. I was tired. But I thought, if anyone drove by, look at that young man out there. Man in his 20s, he could be out doing whatever. He could be partying, because that's what you see. But look at him. He's there serving his church. And that's kind of what I was kind of hoping for. And then here's something else in my openness of how bad I did this. Right here's the parsonage of where the pastor lived. And as I worked for hours, I thought, boy, wouldn't it be good if the pastor saw me doing all this work for the church. If he just steps out, he would say, oh, thank you, young man. And I would get all the reward I would want or need. He never showed up. No one showed up. I'm pretty sure they must have had the roads closed that day, because it seemed like no one drove by, no one walked by, and at the end of all those hours of work, as I was filthy and sweaty and dirty and my hands hurt, I had 7 bags of weeds. Not small ones, but big ones. And when I was done, the Lord said, get in your car, Mark, and take all 7 bags with you, because you're no better than any one of the weeds you just pulled. And I drove them all home. And you think next week you could put them out for garbage. I know they don't like to put lawn debris out now, but back then you could set bags for lawn debris and it would be collected and stuff. So, when I came home with all these bags, I'm sure my dad was somewhat surprised by that. He's like, when you bringing all the lawn? And I put them in our back behind our shed. And then for like the next 5-6 weeks, I had to go around back, get one of those bags of weeds, and put it out front. And every one of those weeks, it was a reminder, because one of the things I learned through that process is what I was doing was what? Done completely with the wrong heart. And week after week, as I was putting out those bags of weeds, the Lord was reminding me, you're no better than the bag of weeds, because all you were focused on was not the heart of doing this for God, to beautify that church. It was simply to serve and someone to recognize what I was doing. Pastor Wayne, who was the pastor here, for many years, and maybe some of you remember this, Pastor Wayne used to say, and it hit me when I was under him and listening to his teachings, he would say, wise is a man who learns from the mistakes, their own mistakes, but wiser still is a person who learns from the mistakes of others. So when you hear this story, don't find yourself out pulling weeds with all the wrong heart. Learn from my mistake and do it with the right heart. You're there to serve God. It's a great way to learn lessons today in what we're hearing. So let's talk a little bit more about cultivating as we talk about this whole soil thing. Cultivating our motives, the reason why or the purpose behind them. The reward, what was to be? If we do good deeds, giving to those in need for attention or recognition of others, that's our only reward. So if someone would have said that day, oh, Pastor Mark, or Mark, you're doing a great job pulling all those weeds, I would have gotten my only reward. And look, I'm not getting any rewards, I know, from that story, which is why I'm not afraid to share it either now, because I know I had the wrong heart for doing it. Same thing in our own lives. What are we if we're looking only for the reward of others, that's the only reward Jesus said you will receive. So here's a question worth asking about getting the reason why we do things, our motives. Are heavenly rewards, do you believe this, better than human rewards? I think below the surface, I think our hearts betray us on this one, of what we truly believe. I think we're more concerned many times of what our human rewards, what others think, as opposed to God. It's a great reminder for all of us to think about today. Now let's talk about this whole confusing thing in those short verses that God talks about, the right hand and the left hand, and it talks about how that left hand should know what's going on. What does he mean by that? I don't fully understand. Let's talk about this underhanded right hand, shall we? Considered the primary hand of action in the ancient Near Eastern world, meaning in that time period, everyone believed the right hand was the more dominant hand. You used it. And I think we can relate a little bit to that. You ever go to school and sit at a desk? Did you ever notice how the prominent hand for the desk, if it's any one of those small areas, is for what handed person? The right-handed person. And you may have never noticed that because, you're right-handed. But my wife, who is also left-handed, notices those type of things all the time. All right? Picking up on that. So we, even in our culture, can realize that. They realize that if you could do work, you could kind of do it with your one hand. All of you this morning, if you shave, did you shave with your right hand? If it was your dominant hand, you shave with your dominant hand. So you probably shave with your right hand. You probably fix your hair with your dominant hand. You talk on your phone usually with your dominant hand. You do those things with the right hand. So the focus is, this is the primary hand of action, as we're talking about with the right hand. In other words, many actions don't need your left hand. So what is Jesus kind of getting at? Here's the meaning. Our giving should be something so normal without special effort or looking for attention or show that our left hand would not be involved. Meaning it should just be part of who we are because what God has called us to be. We just use that one hand that way. The result then, the action rises from a heart, we've been talking about our heart, going deeper, unconcerned with anything other than serving God and carrying out his will. That's really what we're getting at here. If you really want to get down into the heart issue, in this one little section of this very powerful sermon, these 4 verses, he's saying, where's your heart on the sense of your giving and your generosity? Is it to do it to serve God and carry out his will, or to look for some sort of favor from other people? So I want you all to choose to live generously. Meaning the only valid motive, reason, or the why for giving is to do what? To please God and serve his interests. I'm going to close with these 3 stories today. What? 3 stories? Why 3 stories? Well, Jesus himself, sometimes when he was talking about different things, used more than one parable or story to explain himself. When you talk about the lost son, the parable of the prodigal son, or the parable of the lost coin, they were all kind of thrown in there as 3 stories to emphasize something of importance. Because I want to understand and get to an understanding of where our needs or where our motives are in our giving and our generosity. So 3 stories. 1 earthy, 1 watery, and 1 sunny. Because that's kind of like the pictures we have in this whole series. We're going to have, the one playing in the dirt, digging in the dirt. That's the earthy story we're going to talk about. Then there's going to be a watery where the rain comes, the waters the plant. And then there's going to be a sunny story because, every plant needs sun to grow. So all 3 of those things. Illustration number 1, the earthy story. One Sunday, a man came up to his pastor. It was a large megachurch. I guess we're okay on that one. 5,000 people on any given Sunday. The man gave the pastor a $10,000 check for a special need in the church. Well, the pastor was, delighted and thanked him heartily. But then the next week, the man told the pastor, I gave $10,000 last Sunday, and you did not even mention to the congregation that I gave it. Well, the pastor looked at the man and said, well, that statement just let me know the why you gave the $10,000. Ooh. God is not impressed by the amount of money. No matter how large the amount may be, he is pleased with the motive. That's kind of earthy. No one likes to hear those type of stories. Let's talk about the watery story then. The rain of tears, crying story maybe. Suppose for Mother's Day. All right, mothers, listen up. It's coming up. You need to listen to this one. One of your children bought you a beautiful gift. The child had a great deal of money to spare, so he or she bought you the most expensive Mother's Day gift available. But the child still had over three-quarters of their money left over to buy something for themselves. So even though it was an extremely expensive gift, they still had three-quarters of their money left over. Well, then suppose another child who did not have any money came along and gave you a Mother's Day card that they made out of a piece of paper with their own little hands. And they wrote these words, "I love you, Mommy. I love you, Mommy." And it took this child hours to draw because the child wanted to draw the picture of his mother holding his hand. And the child struggled with the paper, and he tried to draw a picture, and Mom's hand looked funny, or his hand, and he ripped it up and threw it away. But spent hours trying to make this card for his mom to let him know how much his mom meant to him, how much he loved his mother. Can I ask you this? Which one of the two Mother's Day gifts would mean the most to you? The one the child gave all they had, or the one who spent the most, but who had the most money left over? Oh, I'm sure everyone would agree that it's the one from the child who made it and didn't have any money. And maybe on the surface you can even say that, "Oh yeah, Pastor Mark, that's an easy one. That's an easy one to tell that part of the story." I'm sure everyone would agree that the one from the child who had no money meant the most because they gave all they had, and more importantly, it came from their heart, right? Because they loved their mom. And it was shown by the card they made. So it got below the surface of just the money, and it got to the heart. So let's hear the son's story, last story. Now, instead of S-U-N, we're going to talk about one of the Jesus, the Son, S-O-N, told his disciples. Because he spoke this Sermon on the mountainside with many people there. But, man, a few years later, he's in the temple, and he has this beautiful story about the widow's offering. In Mark's Gospel, the 12th chapter, verses 41 to 44. Just a few verses again. It said that Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put in and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts. That's not in the gospel, I added that, but you get the point. Many rich people threw in large amounts. But a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Jesus took note to that. I think that's important for each one of us too. Jesus took note and he calls his disciples, "Hey guys, come here. Come here, you got to see this." And Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in everything, all that she had to live on." Now, throughout this sermon, I've had a little mite, one of the 2 mites, not the original. Well, maybe it is, I don't know. 2 mites that were put into that plate by the woman. I've received this a couple years ago by Jerry Duncan on our praise team. And he said, if you ever preach on this, I wanted to share this with all of you about this. These are tiny little coins. And I can leave it up here and you can look after the message today about it. Because when you look at the amount that she put in, just 2 little teeny copper coins. And I've had it in my pocket the whole time and it sounded like a thing of Tic Tacs. And I ever have a Tic Tacs and it makes all that noise. And louder than the trumpets were these 2 little coins that she put in the offering plate, that it caught the heart of the Son of God in it. And I share that part of these stories with you for a reason. I think we got to get below the surface and to get to our hearts. Because God's not concerned about the amount that you put in, but he is concerned about your heart with it. And that'll dictate what you do give. Because I think about that woman, because we can, it's just 2 mites, so we can focus even on the 2 mites that she puts in. But 2 things that stood out on me when I looked at that story. 1, she was poor. She didn't have anything. And yet she did what? She still loved God. She struggled to provide for herself. The second thing that really hit me when I looked at this story was she was a widow. In today's day and age, we have life insurance and people to take care of one another. But in the ancient world, if you were a widow and had nobody else, it was hard to live. It was hard to make it in that life. And there she is, giving all that she has to God, which is shocking because it seems like God had taken everything from her. Do you see that? She wasn't concerned about the outward appearance. She was concerned about her love relationship that she had with God. And she gave everything she had. She held nothing back. Now, when I look at that story and hear that story, and it's preserved for us, that we get to hear about that woman's small little donation, but we didn't hear anything about the trumpets of what those people gave. And I'm telling you right now, church, if you're giving huge gifts, that's not the issue. It's your heart with it. When you give from your heart that talks about your love relationship with God. That's what he's interested in. That's what he cares about. And pastors, sometimes it's a challenge to stand up here and talk to you about the mites, the money. Cling in the offering plates and make sure you put enough in. And I've even had pastors have heard different. Today's Triple Tithe Sunday to get people to give more. And in this generosity sermon or series, I'm not interested in that. I couldn't care less how much you give. But what I, as your pastor, care about is where your heart is relative to God. That's the most important thing. Because for that woman, she lost everything she had. But she still loved the Lord. And your connection and what you're and how you're living, get below the surface. Because the Lord couldn't care less how you look or even how much you give, but he does care about your heart relative to what you give. And I pray for your hearts today. Do you need prayer for your heart today? Anyone else feel a little bit more convicted about these type of messages? Anyone feel like me after pulling weeds? Tired, kind of worn out, hit over the head a couple times? God's not interested in how much, but he is interested in your heart. So let us pray. Father, we thank you for your holy word and your challenges in it and the struggles that we may sometime have to hear it. But Lord, you are looking beyond and below the surface of our lives to challenge our hearts to live generously. But it's more than just the call to live generously. It's the why, the motive behind or to do it. It's out of our love for you, God, that we serve other people, even if no one says thank you. It's why we give, Lord, from our hearts, sometimes even sacrificially, because it's our love relationship with you, Lord. That irregardless of where we stand in our brokenness and our hurting, Lord, and our love relationship with you, we give you our hearts today. We give you our hearts today, Lord. Amen.